find it hard to tell you, I find it hard to take. When people run in circles, it's a very, very mad world.
My name's Richardson. You really think I couldn't see that coming? I can read your mind. Yeah, really. Pick a color. Blue. Pick a number, 17. Now, why are you still thinking about running?
I don't really know what's going on here.
What you've just seen behind a curtain that you weren't even supposed to know existed. Must be jarring. It's not your fault. Your path through the world this morning was supposed to have been adjusted. You were supposed to spill your coffee as you entered the park this morning. You would have gone upstairs to change, you would have missed the bus, and you would have arrived at work 10 minutes later than you did, and we would have been gone.
I was supposed to spill my coffee.
We call that an adjustment. See, sometimes when people spill their coffee, or their internet goes out, or they misplace their keys, they think it's chance. And sometimes it is. Sometimes it's us, nudging people back on plan. Sometimes, when nudging isn't enough, management authorizes a recalibration. We deploy our intervention team, and they change your mind for you, like we did with your friend Charlie. He's fine, by the way. You don't need to worry about him. Now, there's something I need you to understand if I'm going to let you go.
Okay.
Very few humans have seen what you've seen today, and we're determined to keep it that way. So, if you ever reveal our existence, we'll erase your brain. The intervention team will reset you. Your emotions, your memories, your entire personality will be expunged. Your friends and family will think you've gone crazy. You won't think anything. You understand?
Have you ever wondered if someone was controlling your life in behind the scenes? You know, that feeling that you feel when you end up making or not making that light and arriving just a few minutes earlier or later, as though that happened on purpose. Or you dropped that call, or that call got dropped for a reason. Have you ever had moments where it feels like the veil has been pulled back and you get a sense that there is a bigger thing at play, a larger force at work in your life? The film that we just saw a clip from, The Adjustment Bureau, is about playing with that sense and those feelings and those moments. Senses and feelings that God has put into you to let you know, as one of His creatures, that He's there, holding your life closer than you think at times, moving things mysteriously in His providential direction, keeping all of creation. To hold a Christian worldview, which I'm assuming you're holding to some degree in being here this morning, is to believe in the active, present Spirit of God that Christ breathed into the world and that is moving mysteriously. Nobody really knows how, or it's like the wind, but believing that there is such a Spirit and that God is present through that Spirit. To believe in the God of the Bible is to believe it or not, in angels, and that God has these messengers who are fully attuned with the will of God and go about the work of getting God's will done here on earth. That may sound supernaturally wacky. He believes in angels. At the next nearest moment, honey, let's head for the exits. But it's true. And it's all over the Bible. If you know that book and those stories, the Holy Spirit whispering and nudging people to go here or there, impressing truth, and wisdom upon the knowledge of human beings. God whispering directions to people through dreams or through visions. It's mentioned often. And yes, angels often intervening directly into circumstances, God orchestrating and speaking to people through them in order to accomplish His will. This is who the God of Christianity, of the Bible, is. And that is how He works. He's involved. He intervenes. And our challenge then, if that is who God is learning how to listen and see and discern and know and hear our consciences in a noisy world again. Trusting in His leading when we get it with confidence and sticking to what we think God's plan is. There's a great story in the New Testament where the Apostle Paul exemplifies all of those behaviors. And as I thought about it, I thought about the Bible, 55-year-old Bible that my mom bought when I was, not 55, 45-year-old Bible when I was 5. I talked to her this week for her birthday, and she says, we paid $18 for that Bible, which was a huge sum of money for a Bible back then. And I remember her reading it to me as a 5-year-old boy, and it has black and white pictures throughout it, but every once in a while it has a full-color picture, which was the story I always wanted her to read. Like, wow, look at that color. So you can imagine, as a 5-year-old boy, cuddled up with your mom or dad, my mom. You weren't with my mom, I was. And she's reading this story, and I'm going to give you the adult version from the New International Version, but running your fingers over the image and entering into the story the way only a 5-year-old would. So get young and listen to this chapter, entire chapter 27 from the book of Acts. And the context is the Apostle Paul has been taken prisoner by the Roman Empire. He could have got free, but he appealed his case to Caesar, and now he's en route to going to Rome to see Caesar. He appealed his case because God wants the truth about the story that Paul is telling about Jesus to go to the very top of the empire. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, this is written by a guy named Luke who was traveling with Italy and wrote the book of Acts, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon. And Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they could provide for his needs. When you were a prisoner in Rome, you did not get cared for by the Roman society. You relied on friends coming to take care of you. So this nice Roman soldier let Paul get provided for his needs by his friends. And I'm going to stop the interjections because otherwise the story loses its flow, right? Right, Barb, thanks. From there, we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. And there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lycia. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because it was now after the Day of Atonement, and generally from November to February you didn't sail in those days. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that they should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. There was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle, the actual equipment of the boat, overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up and said to them, "Men, you should have taken my advice to not sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you.'" So Paul must have been praying for the people he was with. "So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me." He told me. The angel was synonymous with God for Paul. "Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." On the 14th night, we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found that it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to go lower some other anchors from the bow. And then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes and let the lifeboats drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. "For the last 14 days," he said, "you've been in constant suspense and gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. I urge you now to take some food. You'll need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." And after he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them, and then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. And when they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. And then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping, because in Rome, as a soldier caring for prisoners, if the prisoner got away, you were killed. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and keep them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces from the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. Paul knew with all of his heart that his journey was in God's hand. Completely in God's hand, your journey, even when a shipwreck hits. And you think, oh my goodness, where's this going? I'm sinking. In God's hands. Even when you don't know where you're going to land and what the next bay is, in your hands, in his hands. Paul knew that the promise of safe passage could be trusted, and that circumstances had to play out a certain way. That the sailors could not bail, that you had to eat food because you needed sustenance for what was just about to happen, and strength. Paul knew that the God who made the sea in the beginning, God made the earth, the heavens, and all therein. He knew that the God for whom even the winds and the waves are obedient could be fully trusted. In the midst of the most dire circumstance, he knew where he stood, upon whom he stood. As a kid, I remember engaging into that story so fully, and you're a kid, right? It's true, and it is true, right? But it's so true and real, and you believe everything. I just recall how, of course, God held everything, and you knew it was going to turn out okay, because this was a God story, right? And my mom was holding me, and your Father holds you. Of course, an angel would show up at just the right time and give them the right word so that Paul could be affirmed in the way he did, and then become a messenger of that word to the others so they could be affirmed. Angels were totally real and true and legitimate messengers from God in the imagination of a 6-year-old boy, 5-year-old boy. Of course, this story is true, because surely God does hold everything and will accomplish his good will. Of course he'll get done what he wants to get done. Of course he'll intervene to save his people. God will do anything and everything to keep his good creation on course.
Frustrating, isn't it? My name is Thompson.
Whatever happened to free will?
We actually tried free will before. After taking you from hunting and gathering to the height of the Roman Empire, we stepped back to see how you do on your own. You gave us the Dark Ages for 5 centuries, until finally we decided we should come back in. The chairman thought that maybe we just needed to do a better job with teaching you how to ride a bike before taking the training wheels off again. So we gave you the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution. For 600 years, we taught you to control your impulses with reason. Then in 1910, we stepped back again. Within 50 years, you'd brought us World War I, the Depression, fascism, the Holocaust, and capped it off by bringing the entire planet to the brink of destruction in the Cuban Missile Crisis. At that point, a decision was taken to step back in again before you did something that even we couldn't fix. You don't have free will, David. You have the appearance of free will.
So, that means that we really don't have free will, God, and you're kind of pulling all the strings and we're kind of marionettes playing out this big plan? I don't think that's true. Free will feels too real to me, and it is real. Over the years, as I've tried to hold that question before myself and answer it, I've come to believe that it's both. Completely and fully at the same time. We make choices, and God is providentially getting the will of God perfectly done. The proverb comes to mind. In their hearts, human beings plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. Both. In this shipwreck story I just read, Paul chooses to follow the Spirit's lead. He uses his free will to believe what the angel said, and then he freely conveys that information and steps out onto it in faith in speaking to the others. And God's will gets done. Both. Paul's free will, via faith, wisdom, and discernment, recognizes and is brought into sync with God's will, and the two wills become one. And in that moment, both wills get done. And that doesn't mean that our free will isn't really free either, because there are examples, many in the Bible and in life, where we have free will and it's the wrong choice, and it kind of mysteriously gets pulled back on course by God, often later on, sometimes much later on. Even Paul, in the story I just read, uses his free will in a way that is not in accordance with what God's plan is, and God still kind of works through that, or past that. I read, "Men," this is what Paul said to them, that first word of encouragement, or that first word of warning. "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our lives also." Wrong. The voyage was going to bring disaster to ship and cargo, but not to anybody's life. The whole point of the story, the way God had willed it to be, was that no one would die in that. And yet Paul is inferring quite clearly that lives are going to be lost in this. Sort of like one of those moments when you think God has led you to say something or do something and you do it, but then you add a lot more to it and totally wreck it. I imagine Paul, when the angel later stood before him and said, "No one's going to die here," Paul kind of just gulped and went, "Oops, I might have gone a little too far with that earlier admonition, God." So even St. Paul, the Apostle Paul, gets it wrong. And the gospel of Jesus Christ will be delivered in God's time and in God's way via his will. Or maybe God changed his mind and Paul did have it right the first time. God just said, "You know what, maybe not. Maybe we'll do this differently this time." And all these old stories in the Bible come back. Moses debating with God whether Moses is going to take up his calling to free God's people from the Egyptians. And they're having a debate. "Okay, finally, Moses, you drive me nuts. But you're going to, Aaron, he can talk for you." This is God. Abraham pleading for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah with God. That absolutely hilarious dialogue where Abraham says, "Well, God, if there's 50 people there, will you save the city?" "Okay, 50. What if there's 45 there, God? Would you save?" And gets him all the way down to 10. God's a sucker in negotiations. Or David choosing, after he chose to count all his armies and take account of his glory, now faced with the punishment of the glory of God, where God says to him, "David, you have three choices for how this punishment's going to be meted out. Option A, option B, option C." God partners with us in terms of the will of God being done. Who's choosing? And the Bible only adds to the confusion of the question through all of these stories. And so I don't know what the answer is. You saw the text thing on the slides, eh? If you do know the answer or it comes to you during the sermon, you can text it to me and we'll talk about it later on in the service. In the movie, it's a bit of a cheesy ending, according to my son Thomas, but the two wills come into sync and get resolved in the context of love. And I won't give away the ending, or the plot, but that idea that will alignment and discernment and knowing and being in the right place happens best or happens because of love to me, resonated as very true. It makes sense that the most loving decision that I could make as a human being through my free will would be closest to the will of a God who is love and operates as a God of love in his world. Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." Do this. Paul prayed for the lives of people he didn't know, his friends and his enemies. All those God-made souls on that boat. All those God-made souls in your family or at work or in your neighborhood. He loved them with more of a quality of love like God, his Father, loved them. He loved them as much as the Jesus whose story he was going to tell to Caesar loved them. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Not my will, but yours be done. I think that kind of love is the closest I can get to an answer. If we love like you do, Jesus, we'll be in the best place, perfectly like you perfectly discerned the will of the Father, and share his heart and go where he would go and is going. Then, and only then, I think, will we have the boldness and the strength to be the witness you call us to and trust in your power. It feels a little bit like some kind of spiritual salve or cognitive cop-out or wrapping reason in love and saying it'll all work out. And yet the mystery of the simplicity of that truth seems true, God, and I mean, what could it hurt for any of us to try to be more of that person and more like you, Jesus, in those ways, in order to find our way and to discern your way? So help us in that regard, wherever we're at here, to step into that more. If it means accepting forgiveness for our screw-ups and getting to see your face and know you again for the first time, then may your will be done. If it means letting go of control and how we have to be the ones who make our fates and bring about reality in the future, help us to let go. Run our ships into the shoals if that's what's required, so that we let go and find ourselves back hanging on to you. If we want it with all of our hearts, and sometimes things just don't happen, or we find ourselves slipping away or being apathetic toward you, wake us up. And help us, God, to be a community that collectively and communally is in sync as perfectly as we can be with the will of God for this place and for our community, so that more heaven and earth can come here in this neighborhood, in our neighborhoods, so that people can be saved, so that they can know the assurance of not a hair on their heads being lost, because there is a God who cares for them. Use us to that end. Help your voice to us be your voice to the world in that way, we pray. Amen.